These also are Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied. You're listening to His Generation Podcast, a weekly exploration into biblical truth as we explore the Word of God. His Generation Podcast airs every Sunday morning, so grab your Bible, and here we go. So now we transition to another interesting point in the book of Proverbs. From chapters 25 to 29, they're attributed to Solomon, but gathered or compiled together by King Hezekiah's administration. Well, who is or who was Hezekiah? Hezekiah was the king of Judah, and he ruled the Judean territory of Israel from 746 BC to about 715 BC. And this is about 300 years after Solomon, when all Israel was united under one king. So after Solomon died, his son did not do so well and made decisions that eventually brought division to the nation, leaving a northern and southern separate kingdom. In fact, by the time Hezekiah became king of the southern region, the northern region had fallen into the hands of the Assyrian king and pretty much ceased to exist. And this left Hezekiah, which is a direct descendant of David, to rule the remnant nation of Israel under the extreme pressure of Assyria to the north of him. However, unlike the majority of his predecessors, Hezekiah was a God-fearing king, and to fear God is the beginning of course, wisdom. So as we read these passages about him, we are going to see a person who sought the counsel of the Lord in order to rule God's remnant people. All of the history of Hezekiah is documented in the following passages. Isaiah 37 to 39, you see there Hezekiah believing in only one God in a time when it wasn't popular. They would give worship to many pagan gods during that time. And then in 2 Chronicles 29 through 32, you see Hezekiah cared for God's people, and also too that he was a lover of wisdom. And then another group of passages in 2 Kings 18 through 20, you see Hezekiah really understood and wanted a devotional obedience towards God. In fact, he completely trusted in God, and it's really highlighted in that 2 Kings 18 through 29 passages. Well, let's get into Proverbs chapters 25. It says there, "It is the glory of God to conceal a matter, but the glory of kings is to search out a matter. As the heavens for height and the earth for depth, so the heart of kings is unsearchable." Well, it seems God hides something, and kings need to search it out. That's what that passage really speaks of. In Hezekiah's case, he was put in many positions in which he was forced to seek the answer from God in order to lead his people, which he did by seeking the counsel of the prophet Isaiah, for instance, or you would see Hezekiah reading the law of Moses, or you would even see him go into the temple and present himself to God for service and prayer. And so that's how Hezekiah would search out the things of God. In fact, in the New Testament, this is quite interesting. The saints are called kings and priests unto God. So we can actually take a lesson from King Hezekiah's devotion and how he sought out the Lord's advice in the midst of decision-making over ruling over God's people. Next verse. "Take away the dross from silver, and it will go to the silversmith for jewelry. Take away the wicked from the king, and his throne will be established in righteousness." So the king and his advisors need this same type of refining in order to rule with wise judgment. In Hezekiah's life, he is shown consulting with his leaders and commanders, going to the temple with the rulers of the city to sanctify themselves before the Lord, and while working with the priests to reform the temple order, and with that too, encouraging the Levites to continue performing priestly duties. This is what the refining process looks like in an orderly leadership. Next verse. Do not exalt yourself in the presence of the king, and do not stand in the place of the great. For it is better that he say to you, come up here, than that you should be put lower in the presence of the prince, whom your eyes have seen. Well, self-exaltation is dangerous, and I think that's the emphasis of this proverb, especially before one who has been appropriately given a place of authority. It is a prideful act, but as a believer, sometimes we lose that instruction from the Lord when we try to speed up this process. You never want to exalt yourself. You want to organically allow the Lord or the Lord's people and see how maybe a responsibility of overseeing others is given to you within that organic movement. Now, King Hezekiah, when confronted by the true King of Kings, the Lord himself, let's just say, he learned this lesson and was wise enough to quickly catch his error, and he humbled himself. It says there in 2 Chronicles 32 verses 24 through 26, in the days of Hezekiah, he was sick and near death, and he prayed to the Lord, and he spoke to him and gave him a sign. But Hezekiah did not repay according to the favor shown to him, for his heart was lifted up. Therefore, wrath was looming over him and over Judah and Jerusalem. Then Hezekiah humbled himself for the pride of his heart, he and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that the wrath of the Lord did not come upon them in the days of Hezekiah. Next verse. Do not go hastily to court, for what will you do in the end when your neighbor has put you to shame? Debate your cause with your neighbor, and do not disclose the secret to another, lest he hears it, expose your shame, and your reputation is ruined. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in the settings of silver, like an earring of gold and an ornament of fine gold is a wise rebuker to an obedient ear. So the words in that passage there, like hastily and expose your shame and your reputation and the wise rebuker to obedient ear, all these words come into place as we start to interpret the chapter of Proverbs 25. You'll see it there as we get to the very end where we actually see Hezekiah later on not taking heed to the balance of those things as we unravel chapter 25 a little bit more. Next passage. Like the cold of snow in time of harvest is a faithful messenger to those who send him, for he refreshes the soul of his masters. Whoever falsely boasts of giving is like clouds and wind without rain. By long forbearance a ruler is persuaded, and a gentle tongue breaks a bone. So we have another group of passages there. And in this time, reliable communication over distance is very much dependent upon by guys like Hezekiah, because they would send human messengers that would run from one end of Israel to the other, and they had to get the message exact and delivered in a timely manner. In fact, it is recorded in 2 Chronicles chapter 30 that Hezekiah sent runners to get a message to all those throughout Israel in order to avoid being captured by the Assyrians who were headed to Jerusalem. Imagine how important that message needed to be. By the way, this is solid wisdom to examine ourselves with, because we can ask ourselves, are we dependable and competent enough to complete a task given to us by those supervising us, maybe like an employer? I know as a person that's had positions of management over others, I can share my own experiences. And it's hard when you can't depend on someone who you hire to help you and they don't, and even maybe at times not even show up to work at all. That's what really happens when it comes to that idea of like someone that's falsely boasting or someone that is not a faithful messenger. Next verse. Have you found honey? Eat only as much as you need, lest you be filled with it and vomit it. Seldom set foot in your neighbor's house, lest he become weary of you and hate you. Each of these verses are warning against about overdoing good things and the bad consequences that follow from such behavior. The first warning has to do with eating too much of a good thing. Honey tastes deliciously sweet, to be sure, but those who eat too much of it will find their stomachs can't keep it down. It will make them sick. This principle is not tied just to honey, but also applies to any food. Overeating or overdrinking will sicken rather than energize. The second part has to do with the relationship with one's neighbor. Again, it is not that it is recommended having nothing to do with one's neighbor. It is a matter of overdoing it is what we're looking at here. A person who does so will become a nuisance rather than a friend or a help. With these both proverbs, they still raise the question of application even more broadly. Too much of virtually any good thing has negative consequences. And so that's important because when we get to the end of chapter 25, you're going to see how that all unravels when it comes to the life and times of Hezekiah when he was there ruling the remnant of Israel. A man who bears false witness against his neighbor is like a club, a sword, a sharp arrow. Confidence in an unfaithful man in a time of trouble is like a bad tooth and a foot out of joint. Now again, we got to look at this in the context of Hezekiah's time because exactly he needed faithful men because it was a time of trouble for sure. In this verse here, it is likely that the primary setting of the teaching is in the courtroom, and a false witness could result in the penalties against the neighbors that would really hurt him. The proverb points out that an unreliable or unfaithful person is just like that when trouble rises. Just as a bad tooth will let you down and hurt you when you're trying to eat, or a wobbly foot lets you down and hurts you when you try to walk, so also is such a person. The comparison invites the hearer to think about the character of one's associates and assess whether they will help or hurt when trouble starts. In fact, that's what a guy like Hezekiah would need in his time and his position as a king. Next verse. Like one who takes away a garment in cold weather, and like vinegar on soda, is one who sings songs to a heavy heart. Now, this verse here talks about happiness and how it aggravates a troubled heart. And I've seen this personally. When a person is overwhelmed with bitterness or frustration against his fellow men, a person who has joy in their genuine attitude, unfortunately only brings about a reminder of the miserable condition that person feels. If your enemy is hungry, give him bread to eat. And if he is thirsty, give him water to drink. For so you will heap coals of fire on his head, and the Lord will reward you. Well, our natural inclination is to want to hurt those who hurt us. We want revenge against our enemies. But this proverb presents a remarkable statement of compassion towards their enemies that works against this natural inclination. Instead of harming opponents when their weakness presents an opportunity, we are to help them. And furthermore, God will reward those who act in such a way. What a great word to remember. The north wind brings forth rain, and a hidden or backbiting tongue, an angry countenance. In other words, once gossip is discovered, it produces anger in those whom it is directed. It is better to dwell in the corner of a housetop than in a house shared with a contentious woman. Now, this is a verse that is commonly seen in the Proverbs. In fact, Proverbs 21:9, Proverbs 21:19, Proverbs 26:21 will later talk about the contentious man. And then in Proverbs 27, we see the contentious woman bringing about strife and things like that. This is a figurative verse that is used several times in the Proverbs. In a nutshell, the adjective contentious and the object of a personal, intimate relationship is the focus of this verse. The word for contentious in the Hebrew is madan, which speaks of strife, brawling, anger disputes without any end or resolution. Thus, the action of the other person is to retreat in order to avoid more of this never-resolving behavior. As cold water to a weary soul, so is good news from a far country. A righteous man who flatters before the wicked is like a murky spring of polluted or poisoned well. It is not good to eat much honey, so to seek one's own glory is not glory. Whoever has no rule over his own spirit is like a broken city without walls. So during this time of ancient Israel, a walled city was the first offense against invading nations. Jerusalem was a walled city, and in Hezekiah's life, he and its citizens were surrounded and held captive for a time by the Assyrian military. The walls are what gave Hezekiah an opportunity to calmly seek the Lord for deliverance, in which God responded to King Hezekiah's prayer and caused a great confusion and a supernatural death plague to wipe out those Assyrian soldiers that surrounded the city. In fact, there was 185,000 to be exact. However, this calm and self-control over one's own spirit fell short toward Hezekiah's lifetime, especially when he, without any prudence or any discerning wisdom, showed a convoy of non-threatening yet devoutly pagan Babylonian leaders all the wealth and the riches of the king's house and of the temple. And of course, if we know our biblical history, this was a mistake, because it was the seed that revealed a tempting reason for Babylon to later conquer Judah and sack its treasures and destroy the temple some 70 years later. And you can read all about that in Jeremiah's book. So remember, the overall catch is what's being said here in this proverb, that when it comes to wisdom, there's moderation. When it comes to life circumstances, sometimes those press against you to be seeking the Lord's wisdom. But then at the same time, the moderation would dictate, even in times of plentiness or times of what you would perceive as goodness or luxury, you too need to be seeking the Lord in those times too, because whether the enemy, like the Assyrians, are very aggressive, or the enemies like the Babylonians that were very passive at the time, either way, there needs to be a moderation in you seeking the Lord at all times for his decision making and all that you do and all that you devote to him. Have you found honey? Eat as much as you need, but don't overdo it. You need to have moderation. I think that's the wisdom of these passages in chapters 25. So thank you for joining me, and we will get back to you next Sunday. Thank you for joining us at His Generation Podcast. To receive more information about the podcast, please visit our website, hisgeneration.net, or check out our YouTube channel, His Generation Podcast, for the video format of this broadcast. His Generation is a production of Generation Mars Media, located in Orange County, California.